So this is the 8th lecture for DSE A2 and we'll continue with Gramsci. And in the previous class, I had already mentioned the context in which Gramsci was writing. I had also given you some idea of the intellectual baggage he was carrying. And by intellectual baggage, I mean the scholars before, scholars or thinkers or philosophers before Gramsci, whom Gramsci was influenced by, right? For example, I mentioned Marx, very significantly Marx, because he keeps on quoting from Marx throughout the prison notebooks. Also Engels and even sometimes Lenin. But there are other figures. But we'll just look at the key figures. And apart from that, we had also spoken about the distinction between intellectuals that Gramsci makes. In this lecture, the second lecture on Gramsci, we will specifically look at what he means by the word intellectuals and what is the classification that he presents us with. So before we talk about the definition of intellectuals or the differentiation that Gramsci makes, I first want to talk about a few terms, right? A few terms that Gramsci uses a lot, and Gramsci's intellectual ancestors, such as Marx, had also used, right? So one of these terms, which actually comes from Marx, is class, right? Because you will hear this word a lot, particularly during our course of lectures on Gramsci, but you will also hear this word a lot otherwise, right? So, and particularly if you continue to pursue higher studies, say masters in English, you are going to encounter this word a lot. So what is class? Now obviously I'm giving you a very outline-ish kind of definition. It's not very like hardbound concrete definition. It's pretty broad. All right, so remember that there are going to be nuances depending on the context, but let's look at the broad definition. So what is class to Marx and to Gramsci? A class to these people is a group of people with intrinsic tendencies and interests that differ from those of the others, those of the other groups within society. Okay, so this is a very textbookish language. Let's break it down. So basically there are different groups in society. You know already from your classes on nationalism that people are divided on the basis of race, gender, ethnicity, caste, etc., etc. So class is one of those divisions that Marx pointed out. Marx was one of those people who came out and said that, well, these distinctions are there, that racial differences are there, gender differences are there. What more is there is class difference. All right, so that is what made Marx a prominent thinker, and there are thinkers who are still developing his ideas today. Gramsci is one of them, one of the most significant ones. So again, what is class? So class is again a group of people, but this group is different from the racial groups, ethnic groups, gender groups, right? Class is that group of people which can cut across all of the other groups, right? So if you are someone who belongs to a certain class, it is possible for a person of another race, of another gender, of another religion to belong to the same class, right? So let me give a concrete example. Let's say there's someone whose ethnicity is whose nationality is German, and then there's you whose nationality is Indian. So the two of you are different in terms of your nationalities. However, it is possible for the two of you to belong to the same class, just as it is possible for these two people to be of the same gender. I hope you are able to follow. So yeah, while there are differences on the basis of class, on the basis of caste, nationality, religion, etc., class is also one of those identities based on which people are different. But class is also one of those identities which can cut across, or maybe bisect, to use that word from geometry, across all the other groups of people, groupings of people. All right, now what are the features of different classes? According to Marx, and this is something that Gramsci also repeats in his own way, classes have intrinsic differences within them, and it is these differences which result in antagonism, right? Enmity between these classes, right? Now, when Marx came up with the idea of class, he basically pointed towards two classes, two fundamental classes: the bourgeois class, the proletariat class. I won't go much into that differentiation. We'll look more at what Gramsci has to say, right? So what is most important here is that you understand the idea of class and you understand the idea of what forms class identity, right? It's like think of millionaires or billionaires rather across nations, right? So there's Bill Gates in the United States. There is, I don't know, some rich guy in UK or Germany, and then there is the Ambanis and Adanis in India, right? So these people belong to one class. They have different nationalities. They belong to different racial groups, different ethnicities, right? But Marx would say, Gramsci would say that these people belong to the same class. Understood? So similarly, there are other classes. There is the working class. There is the proletariat class, which is a term that Marx uses, which is often used synonymously with working class. So I'm not going into those distinctions. The important thing, the takeaway from this slide presented before you now, is that you understand that class is an identity of a certain group of people, and then there are many classes. All right. So the example that I gave you, the billionaires example, that may be easy to understand, right? Because there are billionaires in South Korea, there are billionaires in India, there are billionaires in Germany, and these people are not of the same ethnicity, these people are not of the same race, these people may not also be of the same gender, but all these people have something in common, that is class, right? That is the elite class. All right, elite, bourgeois, whatever you choose to call. There are terms that Marx has given us. There are also terms which other scholars have given us. Okay. So yeah, these tendencies, these intrinsic tendencies and interests, we'll look at what these tendencies are later. But remember, there are tendencies of each class, right? So what do I mean tendencies within each class? Again, going back to the billionaire example. The billionaires like Jeff Bezos's and Ambani's and Elon Musk's, they have something in common, right? They have similar tendencies, right? In their own countries, maybe in wherever they're doing business, right? They have something in common. Something in their mentality is symmetrical, right? They are probably seeking the same kind of profit. They're maybe trying to expand their businesses in the same way. So they have intrinsic tendencies and interests which are similar. So this class, the class of people where these billionaires fall, has a certain kind of tendency and interest, and that tendency and interest may be opposed to and is opposed to people who belong to a different class, right? Think of someone who runs a mall or owns a shopping mall, and then think of someone who runs a small business, a small stall outside somewhere in the streets, right? So that person belongs to a different class than the person who built the mall or owns the mall, right? So as you can see, there is an economic thread underlying the idea of class, and that thing is there, right? The class is a very economic idea. All right, so keep that in mind. And this economic idea is what brings Gramsci here. All right, let's move on. So again, I have already given you a billionaire example, but then let's look at the preset example that I put here. For example, it is in the laborer's best interest to maximize wages and benefits, but it is the capitalist or the owner or the factory owner or the mall owner or whatever, like think of the billionaires, right? In their best interest to maximize profit at the expense of such people, like such laborers, leading to a contradiction within the system, even if the laborers and capitalists themselves are unaware of the clash of interests. So it is possible for people of either class to not be aware of the clash of interests, but what happens in reality is that there is a contradiction between these two classes. And how is that contradiction? How does that unfold in real life, in society? So for the person who owns the mall, again going back to the examples which are possible to identify in a metro city, right? So yeah, on the one hand, you have the owner whose best interest is to maximize profit, to increase profit as much as possible. Maybe because he has to keep the shareholders happy, or maybe he just wants to make more money, right? Then again, it is in the best interest of the laborers or the people who have, say, built the mall, or maybe people who work at different stores in the mall, or say the people who guard the mall, and so on and so forth. You can think of hundreds of other working class definitions of people, right? So it is in their best interest to maximize their salaries and wages and benefits. But so you can see that the interest of these two classes are in contradiction. So for the capitalist to increase his profit, his or her profit, he has to minimize the wages of the laborers, and vice versa. If the laborers have to maximize their wages, their salaries, their bonuses and benefits, that will result in minimizing of the capitalist's profit. So this is the fundamental contradiction between classes, and it is this contradiction, both according to Gramsci and Marx, which leads to conflict, right? And it is within this conflict that Gramsci comes up with his theories. It is in trying to explain this conflict, understand this conflict better, and remember from the previous class, to emancipate this conflict. Remember, he's an emancipatory intellectual. So in his attempt to do all of these things, he comes up with the distinction between intellectuals, which is organic intellectual and traditional intellectual. We'll talk about that soon. All right. So next term, keep mentioning this a lot, organic intellectual. Gramsci uses this a lot. Now, you have probably heard of organic growth, organic manure, organic farming, right? So all of these have the same source, some Greek word. So what does organic mean? Organic refers to something characterized by gradual or natural development that occurs from within itself. This is important. Within itself. That is the part you need to know. So let's think of, again, let me give you an example of something that pops into my head. So let's say you start, let's say some of you start an initiative where you start a journal or magazine or something like that. And when you start it, you do not intend for it to become big. You do not intend for it to be read by millions of people. Or think of a YouTube channel that you started yesterday without any intention of it having 1 million subscribers 3 months later or a year later. But that happens, right? And now imagine 3 months later, 1 year later, your channel actually has 1 million subscribers. You never intended that to happen in the first place. So what I'm saying here is that your channel grew organically from within, right? I hope you are able to follow, right? So this is a term which Gramsci uses in the context of intellectuals. We'll see how. But remember this definition of organic, and what is important for you to remember in the context of literary theory, in the context of Gramscian theory, is the fact that anything that is organic develops from within. If you take the example of organic farming, again I'm deviating a little detour, but it will probably help you understand the term better. So in organic farming, it is like one of the key features, the key feature rather, of organic farming is that it does not make use, remember, does not make use of fertilizers, pesticides. So the plant grows from within. That doesn't mean that you don't give water to it, right? That is a different thing. But it is not, the plant is not induced to grow from outside, from without, through fertilizers, pesticides, etc. So similarly, now extrapolate the term organic out of it and keep that in your mind. You will need it when you study on organic intellectuals. All right. Now let's take a look at some of Gramsci's key observations, and it is based on those observations that he devises his theory. Based on his observations, he comes up with the distinction between the types of intellectuals. All right, so what are these observations? First, intellectuals are not a class by themselves. So you already have some idea of what class is. Also, in the previous class, I have already mentioned that intellectuals like to think of themselves as objective. Intellectuals like to think of themselves as not belonging to any class, but as but this is not something Gramsci wants to believe, right? For Gramsci, this is simply not possible. He thinks that intellectuals are rooted in the class from which they emerge. All right. So let's say again take one of those billionaires, right, and think of one of the children of these billionaires who goes on to become an economist, right? Gramsci would say, and perhaps so would Marx and maybe many other intellectuals who think along similar lines, that this person who has come out of that class, which is elite and which is wealthy and which aims at maximizing its profit, maximizing its money, this person will not be an objective intellectual. Whatever intellectualization this person does will be in the interest of the class he belongs to, right? I hope you're able to follow. So let's say on the other side of the spectrum, I've given you an example of a billionaire, or a hypothetical example, of course. Now think of a farmer's son, right? Who was born and brought up in a village, who happened to be a very good student and then received a very premium education, right? Or he was just excellent, whatever. Now this person belonging to the farming class or the working class, and Marx would perhaps call them proletariat. Nevertheless, that's not the point. The point is, in this example, in this hypothetical example, the intellectual, this person, might like to believe that he's being objective. But again, Gramsci would say he isn't being objective either. Whatever intellectualization he does is probably in the interest of the class he belongs to. Now look at point number 3. This is where deviation happens. These intellectuals develop commitments either to their class of origin, or they may also develop new commitments to different classes. Now this is a very, very interesting idea, right? Now if you take a look at the background of a few thinkers, I'll just name a few. For example, think of Marx or Gramsci. What these two people have in common is that they were not wealthy. They were, they were intellectuals from the other end of the spectrum, right? Marx was quite poor, so was Gramsci, right? But Gramsci more fits quite well into the second kind of intellectual I gave you an example of. Which is the second kind of intellectual? The farmer's boy, right? I'm not exactly sure that Gramsci was from a farming background, but I am sure that he was not from the other side of it, right? He was quite poor. He had difficulty in attaining education. He was also a very sick child. Anyway, I'm not going into much biographical detail. The point is, he was from the working class and he happened to get a scholarship at the University of Turin at some point, and then he pursued his education. Similarly, Marx also had a similar story. But then let me give you the example of another scholar. Now this is a scholar which people who have studied sociology would be aware of, and not very often studied in literature, wrongfully so, is someone called Alexis de Tocqueville. Now Tocqueville is a French person who actually belonged to the French aristocracy. Alright, so now obviously I don't have to explain what aristocracy is, but I'll give you an idea of the background of Tocqueville, which is very much in contrast of Marx and Gramsci. So Tocqueville belonged to one of the royal families in France, and his family was one of the victims of the French Revolution. Again, French Revolution, you must be aware of it, what happened in the French Revolution, all storming towards Bastille, like beheading kings and queens, whatever. So all of that happened. Now, Tocqueville's family was one of those families which were directly affected. Some of his own family members were executed. So now, as you can see, Tocqueville belonged to the other side of the spectrum, right? However, as he intellectualized, as he received his education, as he grew up, Tocqueville changed his commitments. He did not align much with his side of the spectrum. Rather, he developed commitments toward different classes. I hope you're able to follow this. But in the case of Marx and Gramsci, they were intellectuals from the working class who theorized all they could, and their commitments lied very much in their own classes, right? So please remember this distinction. This is very important. Point number 3, intellectuals do develop commitments either to their own class of origin, or also in some cases they do develop commitments towards different classes. A lot of examples are possible, but yeah, I'm not going into much detail. Just keep in mind that Tocqueville is contemporary to Marx, right? In fact, some would argue that if you read Marx, you should also read Tocqueville. Their ideas are not always the same, but well, quite different. But since they are contemporary, and since they belong to two different ends of the social spectrum, hence I refer to these people. So keep that example in mind. You probably, if you just look around a bit, if you read about other thinkers and scholars in your own time, you will surely be able to find more examples. Anyway, now let's look at a quote from the essay. Gramsci writes, "Every social group born on the terrain of an essential function in the world of economic production." Now this underlined phrase, now these are obviously very complicated economic terms. I'll try to break them down for you. All right, but everything within that underline, italicized and underlined, like think of those as one condensed term. All right, do not think of them as too complicated. They are not as complicated as they look. So every social group born on the terrain of an essential function in the world of economic production creates itself together with itself. So again, this is going back to the idea of organic. Creates itself together with itself organically. So again, take the example of Marx or Gramsci. They rose from the working class. They were working class intellectuals, and their commitments was towards their own class, creating itself together with itself. I hope you are able to follow. Now, what is this underlined phrase? Essential function in the world of economic production. It basically means economic activity. Like, now you can ask me, sir, why did the translator have to use such a complicated phrase? So again, refer to the previous lecture that the translation is from the Italian, and the Italian was written in prison, which had to get past censorship. Naturally, some of the terms are, circumlocuted. I hope you're familiar with the word circumlocution. If you're not, look it up. Okay, so like every social group creates itself together with itself organically, one or more strata of intellectuals, which gives it homogeneity and an awareness of its own function, not only in the economic but also in the social and political fields. And this is exactly why we are studying Gramsci in literature, because while the source is economic, while the root cause or the base is economics, the effects are felt in society and politics. And what is all literature about, if not about society and politics and economics, right? So that's exactly why we are studying Gramsci, so that we understand society better, so that we understand politics better, so that we also understand economics a little bit more. And with this understanding, we will be able to study whatever text we study, whether it's a poem by whoever, or it's an ad, or anything else for that matter. Anything that exists under the sun. The capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself the industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, the organizer of a new culture, of a new legal order, etc. Now, I hope you have been able to follow the first part. Let me again recap what is being said here in the first part of this quotation. So the first part says that intellectuals grow organically and are often associated or aligned towards their own class, right? And the effect of the economical relationships are felt not only in the domain of economics, not only in the domain of the market, but also in social life and in political fields, right? I hope that's easier. All right. The second part is a criticism of the ruling class or the capitalist entrepreneur. Again, going back to the billionaires, the capitalist entrepreneurs, or going to the mall example where we spoke about the owner of the mall in contrast to the people who were working in the mall, right? So the capitalist entrepreneur, think of all these people I just mentioned, creates alongside himself, what does he create? The industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, right? So industrial technician, you can think of this as an engineer. Specialist in political economy, you can think of this as an economist or a sociologist. The organizer of new culture, you can think of this as a person who writes short stories or novels. I hope you are now able to follow what this economic relationships does to society in general and how it is related to the kind of literature you will study, right? Of a new legal order, it basically refers to judges and lawyers, etc. So basically, again, to explain this second part, beginning with the capitalist entrepreneur, what Gramsci is trying to say is that the elite class or the ruling class, ruling community in a society, it has to justify its existence, right? It has to justify what it is doing. And how does it justify? To justify, it has created many, it has created a subclass of people, which includes the industrial technician or an engineer, the specialist in political economy or economists, then writers, and even the law itself, right? So in other words, these people, the ruling class, their reach is beyond economics. Their reach is not just limited or restricted to the market. They have people in all areas, right, who justify what they're doing. I hope you're now able to follow, right? We'll give more examples along the way. Okay, now, so what is Gramsci's theory? Now, with all of these examples in mind and all of the complicated stuff in mind, the next thing we need to study is what is Gramsci's theory. Now, what I would like you to do before we talk about Gramsci's theory is that you ensure that you have understood whatever I have explained in this class. I know it's in terms of amount of content, it might be very little, but this is content which is quite complex. You need to ensure that you understand, at least in a very broad sense, what class means. You also need to understand what is meant by organic growth, right? Think of all the examples I have given you. You also have to take into account Gramsci's observations, such as intellectuals are not as objective as they would like themselves to be, or as much as they fancy they themselves are, but they actually aren't. Third, that it is possible for intellectuals to develop commitments toward other different classes. And finally, to keep in mind that the ruling system or the current system, according to Gramsci, in order to justify itself, creates other professions, right? It has to have people who would justify it, and therefore it creates all these people, the industrial technician, from the industrial technician to a new legal order. All right. So I will end here. In the next class, we will talk about Gramsci's theory, but today's discussion should form a firm, backdrop against which we will discuss Gramsci's theory. So yeah, please start reading the text, and in the next class, we'll move forward with Gramsci's theory.